Greetings. This video is going to be looking at the essay question, evaluate the view that although the House of Lords has less power than the House of Commons, in practice it exerts more influence on government decisions. In this video I'm going to be looking at the question and then talking a little bit about general essay technique that you should be using and then going through the particular answers to this question and how I might have tackled it, although of course there are lots of different ways of tackling these particular questions. So let's have a look. Now, what's tricky about this question is that it appears at first glance that there's two questions here. So it says, evaluate the view that although the House of Lords has less power than the House of Commons, question one, does it have less? In practice, it exerts more influence on government decisions, potentially question two. Now, the best answers will have elements of both in its response. So it will address the question, does the House of Lords have less power than the House of Commons? And it will address the question over whether it exerts more influence over government decisions. I think it's probably fairly obvious that the House of Lords has less power than the House of Commons. So that one's going to be fairly easy to deal with. You can talk about how the Commons can veto the government, but the House of Lords can only kind of delay and things like that. And the influence one is more subtle, and so that perhaps has a little more advanced things to kind of bring in there. Now, this is a 30 marker, so as usual, you need to be building up a case, either agreeing or disagreeing with this statement. You need to have included both sides, and you need to build up walls before you knock them down. You need to have some examples, you need to have some kind of keywords, some kind of theoretical ideas. Now, this is paper 2 as well, so you also need to have a synoptic link in there somewhere, which I'll come back to a little bit later in the video. So let's have a look at how you could have answered this question. Now, if you're going to agree with this statement, you're going to be arguing that the House of Lords does actually have more influence than the House of Commons does. Well, here's what I'll argue. Now, what you need to do is not just use knowledge, you need to give knowledge, analysis, and evaluation. So the government has no majority in the House of Lords. The House of Lords has huge numbers of crossbenchers, a huge number of liberals, and so what this means that no one party has a majority in the House of Lords, which in practice means that the government is not able to just get things through automatically. There's some kind of analysis there showing you the effect of it. Now, your evaluation here would be, well, what is the overall impact? Like, does that mean it overall has more or less influence on government decisions? That's kind of up to you. Let's go a bit further. Combined with that, there's less party loyalty in the House of Lords. So even though there are several hundred Conservative peers in the House of Lords, they are a lot more independent than the Conservatives in the House of Commons. Many reasons for this, that they are Conservatives from a far wider range of time. They haven't just been elected in the last kind of 5-10 years. So you have kind of like Conservatives that were there in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. So they will have different views. There's also the fact that the Prime Minister doesn't have the same kind of control over them in terms of the whips. And just because they're older, they tend to be more independently minded. So the government cannot whip them as effectively as they can in the House of Commons, which you could argue means that they end up having more influence because the government can more or less just kind of get things through the Commons as long as they have a working majority. Linked to that again is that the government has less patronage and powers of removal in the House of Lords. There are very few government ministers in the House of Lords, like members of the cabinet. In fact, we had, what's her name the other day? Nicky Morgan was briefly in the House of Lords and a cabinet minister, but that's actually very, very rare. And therefore, in the Commons, the government can kind of say, well, do you want that ministerial position? Do you want to be a member of the cabinet? What about your career? And these are effective like sticks and carrots to kind of manipulate the members of the Commons. They can also even threaten to have a member removed. They can kind of say, well, in the next election, we're not going to let you stand as a Conservative. Think about what happened to Dominic Grieve in Beaconsfield, where they took the Conservative whip away from him. He wasn't allowed to stand as a Conservative in Gerrards Cross, and he lost his seat. They can't do that in the Lords because most of them are life peers or hereditary peers. They aren't standing for election, and therefore all these kind of tools that you might have to kind of bribe them with careers and so on, they aren't there. So putting these kind of three things together, you have a House which is far more independent than the House of Commons. And so you could use that to create an argument that they are going to end up having more influence because they're more likely to disagree with what the Commons is doing. Now, of course, you can build that argument up or you can knock it down, but it's a pretty good argument. And this, of course, has led to many more defeats in the House of Lords. Example here, David Cameron's government, the coalition government, had over 100 defeats in the House of Lords, but only 6 in the House of Commons. That's a huge discrepancy. Now, you can either build that up or knock it down in that you can kind of say, well, they had over 100 defeats, but did it actually prevent them from doing anything? Or you can knock it down and you can kind of say, well, actually, build it up and you can say, well, they had over 100 defeats. This shows far more independence and far more influence over what the government is eventually doing. Another one, which is perhaps a bit more subtle, but I think it would make you stand out, is that, as you should be aware, select committees and bill committees and so on, or just committees in general, are more active in the House of Lords. They have more time for a start. Like, they don't have constituency surgeries. They don't tend to be cabinet ministers. They have kind of less things to do, and therefore their committees tend to have more time to research, more time to debate, more time to kind of get additional expertise. And remember, the House of Lords tends to have more expertise than the House of Commons. And that does mean that the committees tend to be able to kind of go really into the detail of various bills and perhaps make very sensible and important recommendations. So again, you could talk about that. Now let's go on the other side. The Commons is without a doubt more powerful. We have not just parliamentary sovereignty, but Commons parliamentary sovereignty. If you go to the Parliament Acts 1911 and 1949, check my dates on that, there's 2 of them, but the Commons is literally constitutionally more powerful because the House of Lords only has the power to delay, and ultimately the Commons can use what's called the Parliament Act to push legislation through the Lords. So despite the fact that the Lords might end up being more disagreeing more and being more independent, the Commons is always able to just kind of push things through eventually. The Salisbury Convention means that anything that's in the government's manifesto is not going to be blocked by the House of Lords. So even though the House of Lords might be more independent, in reality, then they're only going to be independent over certain issues, so says the Salisbury Convention. The government can reverse the defeats. I already mentioned they can only delay for a year, so if the government is defeated, then they can wait a year and they can reverse it. But also in reality, remember ping, pong, ping? What tends to happen is that the Commons says ping, yes, we want this. The Lords might say, actually, no, we don't want this, pong. And then the Commons says, no, we really want this, ping. And then the Lord says, okay, and lets it through. They don't necessarily have to let it through in the second attempt, but they actually in reality do on a huge amounts of things. And I think they did it recently with Boris Johnson's Brexit withdrawal bill. The Lords wanted to see changes to certain aspects of it, like when it was going to take place, the rights of EU citizens in the UK afterwards. And so the Lords sent it back, the Commons sent it straight back through again, and this time the Lords acquiesced and they let it through. The Lords, of course, also lack democratic legitimacy. They aren't elected, they know this, and therefore they are aware that their position in our parliamentary system is on a lower level than the Commons, and so they not only will allow things through, ping pong ping, but they also don't have the power to kind of block things through. And ultimately, does the government really listen to an undemocratic House of Lords? Is Boris Johnson really sitting there worrying what the House of Lords says, or is he more concerned about his own backbenchers, or more concerned about a kind of rebellion in the Commons over certain issues? Think back to Theresa May when she was getting defeated over and over again. Was she really concerned about the Lords, or was it the Commons that she needed to kind of get through? So these are not all of the arguments that you could have brought through, but they are some of the arguments that you could have brought through. There are other things you could have brought in, but these are the main ones I'd go. Whichever way you decide to go, build up one and knock down the other. For the record, if I was going to write this essay, I would probably start off by building up the House of Lords and saying, here are all... I would probably say that the Lords is not more powerful, because I think the arguments on the left are good and you can build them up, but each time you can then knock them down and say, yeah, they're more independent, but yes, there's no patronage, but they get defeated more on the Lords, yeah, but yes, there are more committees, but does the government ever actually really follow them through? It's those kind of things would be what I would be bringing in. Now let's talk about excuse me, I'm just looking for the page. Let's just talk about the synoptic link. So what a synoptic link means, that you have to, somewhere in paper 2, make reference to something in paper 1. And it doesn't have to be long, but it has to be there. So what this means is that somewhere in this essay, you either need to refer to electoral systems, pressure groups, democracy, what else is in paper 1? Voting behavior. There's a few other things in there, I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, which I think is pretty easy to do. You know, if at some point you talk about the lack of democratic legitimacy, you've done it. If at some point you talk about how the electoral system means that the government always has a majority in the Commons but doesn't in the Lords, you've done it. If you talk about kind of the democratic mandate, like the electoral mandate of the Commons over the Lords, then you've done it. So looking here on this left-hand side here, I don't know if I can get it quite on the screen for you, it goes through those kind of links here. The impact of first past the post, the democratic deficit, the electoral mandate. It will, as long as you kind of at some point talked about the democratic deficit or the lack of legitimacy of the Lords, you've already done it. But it's always good just in your head when you're finishing an essay, or maybe halfway through an essay, or even in planning, just kind of go, have I mentioned one of the topics from paper 1 somewhere in this essay? Check you have, tick it off as a tick box, job done. So now, now you've watched this video, you can now go and look at your individual feedback, which I'll tell you how you could have improved your individual answers. Thanks for watching.